ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello everyone, welcome to another Apollo Moon Hoax video. It's been several months since I put out a video. We were really busy. We went through a big moved out of the city into the outskirts of the city. It's a lot less chaotic out here, given what's been going on the last couple of years. But I have been busy working on my third book, which I may talk about in this video a little bit or in a future video. So there's a couple of things that I do want to talk about in this video. First of all, I'm going to be posting this video on BitChute as well. So I think it's good nowadays to have a backup channel. So what I'm going to do for the new viewers on BitChute is just review my first book. And so if you could tolerate that for a little while for those of you who are familiar with my work. And I'll just spend a few minutes on that. And then, of course, I'll talk about book 2. Which has been out now for several months. So for the viewers on BitChute, welcome. And I have been researching the Apollo Moon hoax for quite some time now, many years. And I published my first book called The Apollo Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1. And what I've done is I've accumulated a lot of years of research into this one book, this part 1. So what I'll do is go through the contents, a table of contents briefly here, just to give you an idea of what's in it. In chapter 1, I just talk about the overview. I do a basic overview of the Apollo missions. I introduced everybody to the astronauts. It has been 5 decades, so I just sort of familiarize people with what these missions were supposedly all about. Now, chapter 2, I go through the Saturn rocket and the F1 engines. Now, this is an integral part of the Apollo missions for the reasons that without the F1 engines, which are found in the first stage of the Saturn V, there would have been no Apollo missions. So the F1 engines had to work almost flawlessly, perfectly, and the idea is that they had to produce a lot of thrust in order to launch the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit, and of course then from there they would continue on their journey to the moon and back. Without the F1 engines, these missions would not have happened. The Apollo moon landing missions would not have happened. Not all of the Apollo missions were from the Saturn V. There was one that was actually Apollo 7, I believe, which was used the Saturn 1B, which used less powerful engines. We're not going to talk about that right now. So I focused a lot on the F1 engines in chapter 2, and I go through a lot of the testing that they've done and the static testing versus the actual testing in flight conditions. And you'll see quite a mismatch here. The static testing seemed adequate enough, but you have to have a comparable amount of actual testing in flight conditions. That was not done. And they had a lot of problems with those F1 engines. And so I go through all of that step by step, and I show how these engines could not have worked the way NASA has said. So I'm not going to elaborate too much on that right now. That's very detailed in the book, but just to let you know that I show the process that they went through and how they built these engines, and how in the end it had so many problems, and the testing was inadequate. The testing in flight conditions, that is, was very inadequate, and NASA tried to convince the public that these engines work perfectly. Okay, so now moving on to chapter 3, I focus on the navigation and the Apollo guidance computer. And I show how impossible navigating to the moon and back with that technology in the 1960s would have been. Chapter 4, I talk about the radiation belts around the Earth and intense solar storms like galactic cosmic rays. Now, it's important to note that all of this that I'm talking about could have ended a mission. Any one of these elements could have ended a mission immediately. But I go through it all and I just show the insanity of what they said that they had done. In reality, of course, they didn't do that. So I go through a lot of what you would find, the Van Allen belts, the radiation belts around the Earth, the solar particle events, coronal mass ejections, galactic cosmic rays. Again, any one of these elements which could have led to a disaster. Now, in Chapter 5, I get into the shielding for radiation, thermal control, and micrometeoroids. And, again, I show the inadequate testing, and not so much the testing this time. I'm talking more about the shielding and the inadequate shielding that was used to so-called protect them from all these elements. Again, my conclusions, well, you'll read my conclusions in the book, but there's just, given the, again, 1960s technology, there's just no way that manned missions to the moon and back could have happened safely. And finally, Chapter 6, the conclusion, I go through and I talk about the missing documents, and there are many of them in the Apollo missions. And I talk about the telemetry tapes and how NASA claims that they were lost when in actuality they were destroyed. So I hope that you will check that book out. It's available on Amazon. And so now for the people who are familiar with my work, I'm just going to talk briefly now about Book 2. Book 2 was published 2 years after Book 1, and it's called The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 2. Now, in this book, for all of the readers here, because I haven't talked about it that much, even with those who are familiar with my work, I'll just briefly go through the chapters and give you an idea of what's in the book. Chapter 1, I take a bit of a detour here. And what I'm talking about is a rocket scientist who was very prominent in the 1940s and 1950s. And his name was Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was amazing. And you rarely hear his name spoken by NASA. Occasionally they'll mention him, but you really have to go through great lengths to find out who he was, considering that his theories and his conclusions are still used today. You would think that this man would be talked about a lot more, but no. He actually solved a problem that they've been having with solid booster rockets for the last several hundred years. Believe it or not, that technology's been out for quite a while. He solved it by himself. And what makes this very interesting is this is a man with little or no formal education. He had high school. He didn't have anything after that. So he had no higher math. So he had no ability to do calculus, which is an integral part of, rocket science, if I can put it that way. So basically what he did was he came up with the solutions, and he had others, mathematicians, work it out. And that's how he worked. And of course, Jack Parsons was quite an interesting person in many other ways. What a lot of people don't know is that this man was heavily involved in the occult, and he was very connected to Aleister Crowley. For those of you who don't know, Aleister Crowley was an occultist leader I believe, in Great Britain. He was very prominent over there. And of course around the world after that, and a lot of followers, a lot of politicians, celebrities, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, you name it. This man had quite a following. So that makes Jack Parsons a very interesting person, because in his spare time he was doing a lot of occult experiments. So his work is very interesting. I go through all that here. So that's Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, I talk about the pre-Apollo missions. And what I wanted to do is focus more on the unmanned missions that supposedly led up to the success of the manned missions, the Apollo missions. So I go through all that. And I talk about the Ranger program, the Lunar Orbiter, the Surveyor program, and I show how all these unmanned missions had a lot of problems, and then they jumped from these problems in unmanned missions to seemingly perfection in the manned missions, the Apollo moon missions. So I show how it was just impossible what they claimed that they have done. And I take a little bit of a different strategy here, or what I do is this is arbitrary. I go into determining the success of the Apollo missions based on the history of the unmanned missions. And I show that, it would have been impossible. So that's all detailed in Chapter 2. Chapter 3, I now go through the different options that they were actually considering for a manned mission. I mean, it's just some of them are actually quite laughable. And the fact of which makes it even more laughable is that they were actually considering it. So I walk everybody through that, and I think you'll find that a very interesting read. Chapter 4, I talk about the lunar training vehicles that they have built here on Earth. Now, what they were trying to do is to give the astronauts some actual training. So they built a machine that was simulating the spaceship that would have landed on the lunar surface, and it would simulate 1/6 gravity here in Earth. But they had so many problems with this machine. I mean, they had more problems just trying to keep it airborne than they were flying it at 1/6 gravity. In the end, it turned out to be a disaster. So I go through all of that. And it's interesting to note that with all the problems that they were having with the lunar training vehicle, they landed perfectly on the moon 6 times. So I'll let the reader decide on that one. Okay, so Chapter 5, I go into reentry. I'll talk about the history of reentry and how that came about and how they seemingly solved all those problems, and then apply that to the Apollo moon missions. And that too is, a very interesting read. And then there's a very interesting thing that happened with both Apollo 8 and Apollo 13. Passengers on airplanes claiming that they actually saw the reentry of both those capsules, Apollo 8 and Apollo 13. Now, I'm not doubting the passengers. I think there was something that they saw, but I think they were misled. I think it was a setup. And I go through all that. Now, that particular information I got from the Alice.com website. And they devote, it's a very good website. They devote all of their information to the Apollo moon hoax. So check that out for sure. And that's all documented in the book. So then, of course, and then I have the conclusion, Chapter 6, which is very interesting in and of itself, because I'm talking now about Apollo 13 and how there seems to be some confusion of which Apollo 13 was real, because there's actually 2 Apollo 13 space capsules. A lot of people don't know that either. That's all documented. So that also involved the Russians, the Soviet Union back then, the Russians today. So I go through all of that, and I show how, what an incredible espionage game that was going on. I mean, I think the Russians were actually involved in this too. So it makes for some very, very interesting reading. So I hope you check that out. Again, book 1 and book 2 are on Amazon. I hope that you will check it out. And there's one more item that I would like to talk about here. Just let me get my notes. Yeah. So apparently I've been getting these emails from readers saying that they're upset with me because I talk a lot about the flat earth theory, and I'm thinking, where is this coming from? The flat earth theory, okay? For the record, I do not subscribe to the flat earth theory. I never did, and I never will. I'm not convinced that it's real. There's some interesting aspects to it, sure, but I'm not convinced that the flat earth theory is real. What's happening is people, when they click in on my Facebook page and then they click in on my website, it's taken them to a website on the flat earth theory, and the name says Randy Walsh. That's not me. So I just want to make it clear that is not me. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it's an attempt to discredit me. I'm not sure, but please just ignore it. If you're still getting that, I've tried to fix it. I'll look at it again. If you're still getting diverted to the Flat Earth Theory website named Randy Walsh, please let me know and I'll look further into it. But just to let you know, no, that's not me. Okay. So anyway, I hope that is resolved. And I'm going to continue making videos. Actually, I'm going to get back to guitar, classical guitar, which I really like. And I'm going to be posting some of that. I kind of want to just have a little bit of a variety with this my YouTube channel here. So I'm going to be occasionally posting some guitar pieces just, for fun. And anyway, so I'm going to continue on. I'll be posting, continue on talking about book 2 and other information that comes up about the Apollo moon missions. So until now, I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from